meeting last week, and one of the things that was discussed was what to do in these weekly meetings. And for the time being, anyhow, what we thought we'd do is we'd structure the talks. We do have talks with a variety of people, whoever steps forward, and there's some other people besides me, I hope. And that we would structure the talks around the topics, the order of the topics that are presented in the publication, the profound, profound treasury of the ocean of Dharma. What the profound treasury is, you don't know. Chogyam Trungpa, during his life, every year, or almost every year, starting in 1973, took a group of students away for 3 months, usually somewhere between 80 and 120 or so students, and they would study and practice together, and he would teach. And those periods were divided into both study periods and pure practice periods. And in the pure practice periods, they were run kind of the way a weekton or a datan is, or sitting all day, every day. And I know there are people in this room who've been to them. They were called seminary. And then during the study periods, there would be classes given by some of Trungpa Rinpoche's students, and every night he would teach, or at least most nights. And then there would also be sitting as well during those periods, but a reduced amount. And he didn't like to let people get too sort of regularized, so they would anticipate the periodicity of it. And so, you might sit for a week and then study for 5 days, and then, sit for 3 days and study for 2 weeks, and so it went. And they were divided, these seminaries, the 3 months, into 2 parts: the Sutrayana, which covered the Hinayana and the Mahayana teachings, and then the Vajrayana section. And for many years, those Vajrayana, there were transcripts of all of the talks that he gave over there are 13 different seminaries, ranging from 1973 to, I think, 1986. And there were a couple of years that were missed in there. For many years, the Vajrayana transcripts, the transcripts of the Vajrayana talks, were restricted to people who had been given transmission to do Vajrayana practice. But in his will, and before his death, he made it clear that at some point in the future, those were to be released from that restriction. And so Samaya is the oath of loyalty and secrecy and obedience to the teacher. And they were to be released, and they were. And Judy Leaf then, a couple of years ago, took all of the transcripts and digested them into 3 volumes. And these 3 volumes are called The Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma, which is kind of a pun, because you see Trungpa Rinpoche's name in Tibetan was Ocean of Dharma. It's Chogyam Chiki Gyatso, which is abbreviated into Chogyam, and Chiki Gyatso. And that means Ocean of Dharma. So this is the profound treasury of the Ocean of Dharma. And it is there. It manifests now in 3 volumes. And the first volume is the Hinayana teachings, and the second Mahayana, and the third is the Vajrayana teachings that he gave. And they're terrific, these 3 volumes. Judy did a wonderful job of digesting and editing them. Although, I still recommend going back to the original transcripts, because she cleaned him up a lot, and it loses a lot of the character of him. So for instance, just tonight I was emailing with Derek Kalini, and I referenced a joke that appeared in one of the transcripts hitting out of my transcripts. There was a guy who was Polish at that seminary. Alan knows this. And Rinpoche called him the Polak. And during one of the Q&As, he told a joke. And I'm going to tell it to you right now. Here's the joke. The joke is that there are these three bums. You know this joke, Alan? You know? And they're traveling together. They're hobos. And they hate to cook. All three of them. But somebody has to cook. So they make an agreement between them that, and the Polak stood up and told this joke to Trungpa Rinpoche during the Q&A. And I think it's a very appropriate joke for tonight's topic. And the joke was so that they made a pact, they made an agreement between them that they would draw straws, and the loser would cook until the other two just couldn't stand his cooking anymore. And then they would draw straws again and somebody else would cook. So they did this, and this fellow lost. And so he had to cook, and he hated cooking. So the first night he's cooking the stew over the campfire, and when the other two fellows aren't looking, he throws some dirt into the stew. He serves it up to them, and they take a couple of bites, and they can tell something's wrong with this stew, but they don't say anything. So the next night, he's kind of chagrined about this, that he still has to cook. So this time when he cooks the stew, when the other two guys aren't looking, he pees in the stew. Serves it up to them, and they take a few bites and turn slightly green, but they don't say anything. The third night, there's always three, and they're in a joke. Third night, when the other two guys aren't looking, he shits in the stew. He serves it up to them, and the first guy takes a bite of it, and he says, "Oh, God Almighty!" He says, "This tastes like shit, but good." And you see, that was a metaphor for life. And the Polak was making this analogy. It tastes like shit. Good. That's a useful phrase sometimes you might find.
You say that after you take your first toke. This is good shit.
You say that after you what?
Your first toke.
Your first toke?
This is good shit.
Of good shit. Okay. That's a different, I think that's a different meaning to it. So what we're doing here is what we decided to do to give us some structure to see where we while we're sort of searching for direction for this group, is that we decided we'd just take the topics from the Profound Treasury and use them as starting points for talks and discussion among ourselves. And so here I am, and I'm taking the very first topic, which is titled Beginning at the Beginning. The very first topic in the first book, Volume 1. And I went through it, and for those of you who are going to follow me at some point, you're invited to take the topic and do whatever you like with it, if you're going to be teaching, some of you. Whatever makes sense to you. Yeah, oh, you want this up? Okay, fan. But I just took the reading, and also you're invited, we'll send out emails, and you're invited to do the reading to better prepare you for the discussion, although I think these talks are standalone, and if you come in without having done the reading, I'm sure you can benefit and participate just fine.
Could we have more than 24 hours notice?
Yes, I'm sorry. This is a really, everybody's doing everything here. I mean, Carrie's our sound guy, and I'm giving the talk, but I'm also sending out the emails. I've learned how to use MailChimp, finally. And we'll see where all this is going. So the quote is, "Since enlightenment is based on dissolving the ego," and by the way, you've already got notice of next week, not next week's, we're not meeting next week, because it's the 4th, but the week after, it's the second topic, and I think it has a forget what it is, something to do with ego.
Yeah.
Huh? Do you actually have the email? Oh, you do.
Book.
I have the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just went through and I noted the things that were particularly meaningful to me. Since enlightenment is based on dissolving the ego and its expectations, it has been said that you cannot watch your own burial, and you cannot congratulate yourself on becoming the first Buddha of the age, or the first Buddha of New York. It was very appropriate, right in the very first lines, first page of the Profound Treasury, he's referencing New York. So there's a lot in that statement. First of all, it raises the question of what is ego? And I put it to you that what ego is the voice that we carry around, which Trungpa Rinpoche sometimes called the watcher. I always envisioned the watcher as kind of a parrot wearing a Keystone Cop hat, and sitting on my shoulder and making these comments about my life as I lived it. And the comments are things like, "Oh, that's good. Oh, that's bad. Oh, don't do that. Oh, if you do this, you'll get something out of it," and making all these sort of extraneous comments. Rinpoche also called him or her, the hitchhiker. That voice, that entity, is hitching a ride. You're actually in there taking the trip, but that voice that's making all the comments is hitching a ride, and it's kind of unnecessary. Just sort of a temporary voice from time to time that arises, although it arises a lot. I recently read somewhere online, somebody sent out an email that said that, I don't know how they come up with this, that we have 50,000 thoughts a day. I mean, it's credible, don't you think? And yet, who's counting? How do they do that? But this voice carries with it all of the pleasure and pain, or at least a lot of it, a lot of the neurotic pleasure and pain that we suffer. And it has to do with especially depression. When one wakes up in the morning, that's when one is particularly vulnerable to depression. And Rinpoche used to, ask us all the time, as his students, he used to say, "Please cheer up. Please cheer up," he used to say. And sort of begging us to cheer up. And the time when we need to cheer up most is in the early morning when you first arise and wake up out of bed, because that's when one is most vulnerable to depressing thoughts. So it's a good idea not to lie there and think, but to get up and go pee and brush your teeth and whatever you're going to get doing and get moving. And then the thoughts continue throughout the day, and we are constantly having judgmental thoughts, evaluative thoughts, all kinds of thoughts, and we're lost in a kind of sea of thought through which we see the world. It grays the world out. It's kind of like wearing sunglasses. All these thoughts sort of passing before our eyes. And then there are gaps in the thoughts, when suddenly the world emerges more vividly, because somehow the thoughts part, either by our intention, because we are remembering to come back and practice mindfulness, which is really what mindfulness is all about. It's creating a parting of those thoughts, or because something just causes those thoughts to part. In the Great Perfection teachings, the Chogyam teachings, they talk about 5 moments, 5 things that cause those gaps. One is sudden shock, like you're walking down the street lost in thought, and a cabbie blares his horn, or somebody blares their horn. Happened to me today. This truck was right next to us with the loudest goddamn horn that I've ever heard. Oh my gosh, just made me jump. And so there's a sudden shock. A sneeze is supposed to be one of the 5. Of course, meditation practice, where you remember to come back That's 3. The moment of orgasm can do it. And the 5th one is the experience of actual death. Can wake one up. And that's actually the most profound. And there are all kinds of teachings about that. So we're dealing really, especially as we enter the path, with the issue of this voice and the stories that it tells. And really, this voice is the bearer of karma. It is karma manifest. And what karma is our enslavement to the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and our world. And these stories are value-laden, they're about the past and the future, and they entrap us into a particular kind of life. And they make us, largely, for the most part, unhappy, with little moments of happiness in between. Enough of those to sort of keep us on the treadmill. But largely, these stories are not happy stories. They're stories about regret for things lost in the past, and mistakes made, and of hope and fear for the future, and of self-criticism and all kinds of things. They're very, very laden with self-criticism. Really, that's almost a definition of ego, is that ego is critical of oneself. This voice that we carry around is constantly criticizing and limiting us. It's saying things like, oh, don't try that. You'll never succeed. Nobody's going to like you if you do that. Nobody's going to like you anyhow. But if you do that, they really won't like you. You're bound to fail. Maybe you'll succeed. Oh, that was a good one. You had some success there. You should try and capitalize on that. But really what's behind that is, the fear of failure as well. And that voice of self-criticism waxes and wanes. Sometimes it's when we're in a good mood, so-called, it's diminished. And really what being in a good mood means is that we are sort of optimistic enough about our lives that we can let that voice trail off and we begin to come present more and be more in the present moment. And people like us more when we do that because we're more available. Whereas when we're lost in sorrow and depression, we're largely unavailable. We're cranky, we're removed, we're depressed. So the act of meditation really is all about cutting through that voice one way or the other and coming present. Coming into the present moment, which is open and voiceless. It's like we're right here now. And there are different techniques for doing this. These techniques, working with the breath is the classic one. And the breath is kind of a handle for pulling oneself into the present moment, because the breath takes place only in the present. So you're lost in thought, and then you say, oh yeah, I've forgotten the breath. And we come back to the breath, and it pulls us back to the present moment. And then there are other techniques, especially in the Vajrayana, and in the Mahayana too, different kinds of practices that we might engage in. But they're all engaged in one thing, and that is to cut through that voice, the watcher, the ego, the story, which is our karma, and come into the present. Now, in order to do that, we really need, among other things, to become aware of what the voice is telling us. Those are our particular stories and our particular patterns. And so part of the practice of meditation is to see what the stories are that you're telling yourself, and then just to let them go without any kind of judgment and come back to the present moment. The trick is how we handle that transition from being lost in thought to coming back. And if we treat it as another kind of self-improvement project, like oh, I'm going to be a good meditator, I'm going to be mindful, well, then that's another form of self-criticism. Because we're saying to ourselves, oops, I was a bad meditator. Oops, I was lost in thought. I'm a terrible person. I'm going to come back, but what lingers is that feeling of failure. It sort of lingers back there as subtle kind of self-criticism. So the idea is increasingly, Trungpa Rinpoche called this having compassion for yourself. That you don't criticize yourself for having thoughts. You just let them go. And when you let them go, you come back to your practice, whatever it may be, in the present moment. In the Great Perfection teachings, they say that all you do is you acknowledge thought and it self-liberates. It just goes poof, it just evaporates. That's what thoughts do. Just like these words that are coming out of my mouth. They come out, you hear them, they're gone. And thoughts do the same thing. Unless we chain onto them. Oh, I had a bad thought. Oh, I had another bad thought. You can go on and on like that for a while until you get exhausted. So, he says, the issue is that you can't really be there for your own burial. He says there are other times he used to say, the ego can't be there for its own funeral. Because really what we do when we come present, all that ego, there's no room for it. It's like mist that has evaporated because in the sunlight of awareness in the present moment. There's just no room for that voice when we're fully awake. And that's the practice. Especially at the level of the Hinayana. And that's why they talk about the Hinayana, the so-called, literally it means in Sanskrit, lesser vehicle. Yana is vehicle. Hina means lesser. Trungpa Rinpoche preferred foundational vehicle. And the main contribution of the foundational vehicle is to begin to understand lack of ego. That ego doesn't exist. That it's just a story that we tell ourselves. And in that realization, we begin to cut through suffering. Because suffering lies in that voice. Suffering is that constant feeling of regret for the past, fear of the future, sorrow for what we had or don't have or won't have. All that evaporates when we come present because we are literally not thinking. And he says here in the same vein, you have to know your mind, the neuroses, the positive possibilities, the obstacles. And that's just what we've been talking about. The neuroses are all these stories. The positive possibilities are the ability to come present and live your life as it really is in the present moment, without these false stories, these idiosyncratic stories that each one of us has, which aren't really true. They have some element of truth in them, like you do have to pay the rent, but the fact that you're telling yourself that or whatever it is over and over and over again, and it's fear-laden, that isn't necessary. That's ego. That's ego trying to pull you down. If ego has its way, we will kill ourselves. We will commit suicide. It's really a matter, it's trying to freeze us and bring us down. He says, life is painful. Everybody will eventually die. So now it is time to do something with your life. And really what that's about is the old Buddhist idea, the injunction, that this opportunity that we have is so precious that we must take advantage of it to free ourselves from this chain of this imprisonment in the story. Because if we don't, we will cycle through one story after the next, continuing. This is what we're dying and being reborn all the time, right now. As one story ends and a new one begins, or as the telling of one story ends and the telling of a new and repetitive story begins. And slowly, over time, these stories morph. And we're different. We're telling ourselves different stories now than we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, or however long it was. But they have slowly changed as they evolve. It's kind of like, I came up with this explanation for how karma works. That a child is walking down the street with its mother, and she's looking in the windows and shopping, kind of, window shopping, and the child sees a dog and goes up to the dog to pet it, and the dog's a mean dog and it bites the child. This is a traumatic event, and the mother rescues the child and life goes on. But the memory of that trauma is stored in the child's unconscious. And in Sanskrit or in the Tibetan tradition, Freud called it the unconscious, but this is a 6th century Buddhist teaching, and it's called the alaya, which is the storehouse. And in the storehouse, all these memories, they're called seeds, are stored. They're called seeds because they lie dormant. That memory lies dormant in the alaya until something triggers it. So maybe a few months later, the child's walking down the street again. Now it's forgotten completely about the dog. It's living a life. This child, maybe it's a 3 or 4-year-old child, a toddler, and walking down the street again. And there in the distance, the child sees a dog. And suddenly that memory of being bitten by the dog springs to life. The seed is watered, as it were, by external circumstance. And it sprouts. And fear arises in that child's mind. So the mother sees what's going on, and she decides to see what she can do here. And she checks out this dog, talks to its owner, finds out the dog's a sweet, friendly dog. And so she brokers a meeting between the child and the dog. And now the child learns that not all dogs bite, that this dog is friendly, it licks its face, it jumps up and down, it wags its tail. And so that plants a new seed in the alaya, which is not all dogs bite. Some dogs are sweet and friendly. And now, the next time the child meets the dog, the 3rd time, it's going to have those 2 seeds, arising, being brought to life, and it will have a very different reaction than it had the 2nd time. This is what we're doing all the time in our lives. We're going along, and we're constantly, our karma is rolling forward as the stories change, as they're watered, as it were, by experience. So it's very important that we become aware of the way in which we are enacting and enslaved by these stories. Otherwise, we can't cut through them. I mean, the world is full of people, including us, who are walking down the street just driven by their stories. And most people don't even know it. They're just thinking, and they're lost in the truth of the stories that they tell themselves. I've got to pay the rent, I've got to find love, I've got to be healthy, I should work out more, I'm too fat, and whatever it is, I'm ugly, nobody loves me, I'm unsuccessful, I'm very successful, I'm proud, and this is what constitutes being in the realms, psychologically, in the 6 realms. These are psychological portraits of the stories that dominate us. So the God realm is dominated by a story like, I've got it made. I'm a successful person. Everybody loves me. Everything I see is beautiful. Everything I smell is perfume. Everything I taste is nectar, ambrosia. And I'm God. And a hell being is somebody who sees the world as a constant threat to their very existence, and they're terrified and furious and full of aggression because they need to protect themselves, and so forth, in all the different realms, these stories that we tell. I mean, there's an analogy for this in the Buddhist teachings. They say that take a drop of water, and to a hell being, that drop of water is molten lava. And to a hungry ghost, that's somebody who sees the world as being constantly not enough. That drop of water is pus. And to a god, that drop of water is fine wine. And it's all the same water. You know, everybody just seeing the world through a different lens, different story. So really, the whole point is that of these teachings is to help us cut through these stories and come into the real world. And the Hinayana, what he's talking about here, is all about that. He says, samsara, meaning these stories. Samsara is confusion, right? And samsara literally means a circle. The Tibetan is korwa, which means spinning. What are we spinning? We're spinning through these stories again and again, and we're going along like this because they evolve, these stories, like spiraling. And he says, samsara is like the epitome of an hallucinatory drug, a super LSD, because you see the world through this tremendous distortion. Finally, this is the last quote. Nobody is going to do it for you. You have to begin by yourself. You should be shocked when you realize that you have been trapped and imprisoned, because then you might do something about it. You have been too naive. You have enjoyed your samsaric life too much. You should have been shocked a long time ago, he says. I'm sorry that I'm the one to bring you the bad news, he said. Although possibly, quite remotely, I might also be bringing the potential of good news. You know, the Dharma is often called the good news. Well, actually, it's the gospel, which is the good news. So, I think I'll stop there.
Okay.
Anybody want to talk about that? Yes. Henrietta. Oops, we're going to pass the mic.
Oh, yeah.
That way, we're posting the recordings and people can hear you.
Thank you, John. That whole business about depression in the morning, is there a reason for that? I mean, I definitely can relate to it. I've had it, noticed it for a long time, but I'm not sure. Is it some kind of it feels like some kind of gap to me, and but it is definitely feels like depression.
I think the reason is that at night, the alaya is kicking up very, very deep stories. These are the dreams that inform us. And a lot of them are things we haven't thought about for a long time. You know, the Bardo teachings say that what's going to happen when you die is it's not going to be, what you experience is not going to be your immediate life. Rather, it's going to be your weightiest karma that predominates. And this is what happens at night, too, when you dream. Your weightiest karma, meaning the most powerful karma from your past, is, like, you know, these stories, is coming to bear. And we're completely lost in it. But in the morning, when we wake up, then we start remembering the stories we've been telling ourselves recently. And you're in a kind of in-between state. You haven't engaged the phenomenal world yet. You're still lying in bed. You're still, you know, in a very mental place. Because you haven't gotten up and said, you know, engaged the physical, visual, tactile world. And so you start going through a lot of, you know, the more recent stories. That's all I can figure. But it's definitely, I think, the case that for many people, it's the time when we're most subject to depression. And Rinpoche talked about that.
It's so interesting. And I definitely sense that transition from something to something else. And to me, it had something to do with the dying process. But I wasn't quite clear in my was I dying and now coming back, or it's, I don't know.
It's a good
Strange,
question.
yeah.
Anybody have any other ideas about that? Michael?
Well, I think you're losing the illusion of the dream ground, and you haven't quite solidified the awake ground, and it's a very disquieting place.
The what?
It's a very disquieting place to be.
Why is it so disquieting?
Well, I think we like the ground.
Huh?
We like the illusion of the ground, and in the dream state and the sleep state, there is an illusion of the ground, and it takes a while, I think, to reassemble the illusion of the awake ground, and in between you're sort of stuck.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's about uncertainty. Depression has a lot to do with it.
Uncertainty, what?
I think depression has a lot to do with a response to uncertainty.
That's interesting.
It's also interesting. It's interesting to me that he says to get out of it, engage, rather than maybe stay with it and explore it. I'm not sure.
Well, he very much wanted us all to cheer up. Right? I mean, remember, he hated the expression, I don't know if he hated, but he didn't like the expression happy birthday, because he thought it was kind of pathetic, you want to be happy, and instead he changed it to cheerful birthday, so a lot of us still do that, wish each other a cheerful birthday. It's funny.
Interesting answers. It's kind of interesting when you're talking about the seeds with the dog experiences. And I'd always heard that Trungpa Rinpoche had reached the point where he didn't create karma. So you're describing planting the seeds in your own laya as creating karma, right? So what's the process of not creating karma? How do you not plant seeds so the seeds evaporate like the thoughts pop in?
I think that the way you not plant seeds is by realizing that this world right now is the real world, and that the world that we think about is fiction. And then one can begin to shift one's loyalty from the fictions that we so firmly believe in, and that they begin to dissolve, and we can shift our loyalty to the world as it arises in the present moment, which includes the past and the future, because that's how we got here, and it's, we're all going to leave and go out on the street in a little while. And yet, it's the dreaming about the past and the future that enslaves us, those fraught dreams that are full of me and worry about me and my welfare, and that goes. That's what goes. That's where karma is. What's not being talked about in this talk is the flip side of this, which is what is revealed when these stories evaporate. And what is revealed is this world as it arises in the present moment. And it's described in various terms in the three bodies of the Buddha, the three, that's one way it's described. And it's in terms of emptiness, luminosity, all kinds of things. But what it's mainly it's described as being is without essence, without true being. We constantly live in a world of things. We treat ourselves as a thing that has true existence, and everything around us as things. And one of the first teachings of Buddhism that releases people from these beliefs in karma and from the stories is the discovery that actually no thing actually exists in the way in which we thought it did. That things have no inherent existence, no fundamental ongoingness. There's no continuity, no lastingness. Anyhow, that's another subject, and I didn't mean to get into it. But there's these two sides: the description of reality, and how we might switch our allegiance to it, and then what we leave behind, which is the confusion, samsara, the myth, the dream, which has enslaved us from time immemorial, they say, because it always seems like it's been going on forever, doesn't it? This whole story about me. It seems like from beginningless time, we can't remember when it began. And this is all about waking up from that. That's why they call a Buddha an awakened one. They wake up from this dream of karma. Yeah.
Well, it seems that you alluded to two ways of approaching karma. One is through the realization of emptiness, and the other is through coming back to the present, which are certainly related. But in the traditional Buddhist teachings, which depicts karma as a chain reaction, there's a moment there when we connect with something, anything. There's a sensory input, and there's this contact, and immediately, as soon as there's contact, we have this sense of, I like it, I don't like it, or I don't care. And it's not really even at a conscious level, it's more of just a very subtle feeling. And that's the moments we can cut the karmic chain, because what usually happens is when we think I like it, then we start to go for it. That's when craving starts. So when we don't like it, we start to get aggressive and want to push it away. So after that initial contact, then we immediately feel like when we look at people in the street, yes, no, maybe, yes, no, constantly evaluating everything to just become aware of that process of continual evaluation, which means cutting the stories about what we think other people are about, and coming back. So if you're awakened, you're continually living in the present, and you're not using the metaphor of the seeds. You're not continually watering those seeds. Those seeds are just going to shrivel up and transform into wisdom, it is said. Yeah. And then, of course, you can go back to the beginning of the chain and look at the whole idea of self and contemplate that and begin to see the illusory aspect of the self. So there are those two ways of reducing and eventually eliminating karma.
Well said. Terry.
So I just have two things. One is a point going back to what you're talking about with dealing with anxiety and depression and stuff in the mornings.
Mm-hmm.
There's a song by an artist named York, who I don't know if you know, most people probably know, and it's called Hyper Ballad. And I once
it's called which?
Hyper Ballad.
Hyper Ballad.
Yes, and I think it's actually a song about exactly Bjork dealing with that sort of anxiety and negativity and depression and stuff in the mornings before she wakes up. The chorus goes something along the lines of, I go through all this before you wake up so I can be happier, to be safe with you, but she's talking about what these things that she goes through in the morning. So I definitely recommend checking out Hyper Ballad in relation to this talk. I think it'd be really very cool. The other thing I had is a question about, you said something very interesting, which is that the ego, if it had its way, would, it would freeze us and kill us even. If we really got caught up in the ego the sort of depression and anxiety that comes with it, or the fear, really, right? And that's interesting. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because it seems that the ego, the function of the ego, the ego developed to kind of keep us alive in a way, right? The fear and the anxieties that the ego thrives on seem to be actually, in some way meant to help us stay safe as maybe animals or just as human beings in a dangerous world. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. The problem with that view of safety that the ego has is that it's static. In other words, for instance, nobody wants to get old. Nobody wants to get wrinkles, gray hair, get fat, lose their muscle tone, and die. Ego is saying, no, 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 no. But we're going to do that. And to fight that, the way ego does, is a sure path to sorrow and depression. So you see, ego wants to freeze us in time. It wants to keep us forever young. Just the other day, the kids in my daughter's class sang that Bob Dylan song. Actually, about 3 months ago, I watched The Last Waltz, Martin Scorsese's film about the band, their last performance. Have you already seen that? Yes. And at the end, Bob Dylan comes out and sings Forever Young. You may be forever young. And the irony of it is, he was young. And he's not. That film was made in 1976. How old is he now? What is that? That's 40 years ago. So he's got to be in his 70s, well into his 70s now. He was in his 30s then. Nobody stays forever young. And that's what ego wants us to do. So ego is constantly trying to freeze things. You see, ego sees the world in terms of concepts. And concepts don't move. It's like a chair is a chair is a chair. Meanwhile, you experience that chair, how you sit in it, how you see it, this way, that way. But we think of it as a static thing. And we don't want that chair to ever wear out and break. That's the problem with ego. It's dealing with a world of dead objects. Because concepts are essentially about things that move, but when they move, they're not the same thing. That's the fundamental conflict and problem in language. When language can't really capture reality, it's because it's about static things moving. It's like nouns verbing. But reality is, there is no static thing, and you can't find the thing that's moving. Because it's already changed, it's different, it's something new. Instant by instant. So, if you try and, the Tibetans, the word for concept in Tibetan, namtak, literally means tag. And it's like as though you took a tag and you wrote the word person or chair and you tied it to that thing. Because the reality is a constantly moving, changing thing. It's just a word, a label that we fix on. But we become obsessed with the labels, as though these labels have a reality, when they don't. They're just pointers. Herbert Gunther, who was an early expositor of Tibetan Buddhism, said that in Buddhism, words are just viewed from an enlightened point of view as useful ways to take things. Useful ways to take things. Not as really true. Huh?
What does that mean, take things?
Sort of like, now I'm going to brush my teeth. It's like, you're going to go and you're going to do this thing. At what point did you start brushing your teeth? At what point are you brushing your teeth? Is it when you put the toothpaste on the brush? Is it when you put it in your mouth? When you spit out the toothpaste? Is it the whole thing? Well, the whole thing is very different, right? There's a lot of things involved. But we sort of lump it together under one word. And we say, and that points to something. When did it begin? When did it end? Did it begin when you actually picked up the toothbrush? Did it begin when you headed towards the bathroom? Did it begin when you got the idea in your mind? You know, it's like there's this constant continuum, and we make arbitrary divisions. I make a gesture. When did that gesture begin? You know, and has it ended? You know, like that. But we say, oh yes, he made a gesture with his hand. And so it's all sort of for the point of view of words. And that's what ego trades in. They say, you know, the basic idea is that the false belief that we have is what's called the belief in inherent existence. The term in Sanskrit is sva-bhava. Sva means own and bhava means being, rangjin in Tibetan. And that we believe that things have their own being. And own being has three qualities. This is the belief of ego, right? Three qualities. One is that it endures unchanged over time. Things endure unchanged over time. In fact, nothing endures unchanged over time. In two ways does it not endure. One is that even though you can't see it, everything is basically disintegrating, right? We're aging as we sit here. Our cells are deteriorating. We might not see it in a minute or a second, but it's happening anyhow. But the real way in which things are impermanent is that they are arising right now. And right now I'm looking over here at
Anna.
Huh?
Anna.
Anna. And now I'm looking at Carrie. So there's what I'm experiencing is changing instant by instant. As these words come out and you're listening to the words and then they disappear. I mean, nothing endures in the present moment. The analogy for this, there are many. They say it's like an illusion. I don't like that one because that implies there's something real behind it. There's another analogy that I do like. They say that this is like the arising and passing away of images in a mirror. You know, when you look in a mirror, you can't find it, right? You can't grasp it. It's constantly changing. That's what we're sitting in the middle of. It's like a 3D movie, right? So that's the first quality that ego gives to things, that things endure without changing for some period of time. Maybe eternally, maybe just for a few minutes even. The second quality is that they are independent, that things exist independently. You know, I'm going to leave here, I'm going to go home, I'm not dependent on you guys, but I am. You know, I mean, we all are. We exist independent on our environment. We're constantly moving through it. You know, you raise your hand and is the hand moving or is space changing color, like pixelating? You know? And so they say the second false quality of ego is that things are independent. And the third is that they're unitary. That means that they exist as one thing. I remember when I read years ago, there's a wonderful writer named Lewis Thomas. Anybody ever read Lives of a Cell? No? Maybe it's after most of your time. Lives of a Cell is a series of essays on science. And he talked about how we think of ourselves as a unitary thing. But actually, all our cells have teeny-weeny little symbiotic organisms in them called mitochondria, which process food and turn it into energy. And they're actually organisms that are separate from us. And so he said, rather than saying, I'm walking down the street, it's more correct to say, we are walking down the street. Wonderful essay. Great book, Lives of a Cell. So we think we're a unitary, but we're not. We're plural. You know? I mean, which part of you is you? Is it your arm? Is it your hand? Is it your brain? Is it your eye? Is it your body? Which, you know, all of that is changing and you can lose it. And there's still some feeling of I. This constant I. So those are the three things that are attacked in the idea of egolessness, no self. That there's no endurance, no ongoingness, no independence, and everything is multiple. That what we think of as me is really a collection of experiences, events that are happening all of it. Alan.
Your notion, Terry, of your question about ego serving as some kind of security and sense of safety. made me think of the opposite of that. There's a notion of the spiritual warrior, also called bodhisattva, and they say the vulnerability of the bodhisattva, of that warrior who's completely open, is his armor or her armor. That basically there's nothing to defend and there's nothing to protect. So, and also I was reminded of a very touching story I read in the Sunday Times about an athlete who committed suicide.
Athlete?
Athlete who committed suicide.
An athlete?
Athlete.
Okay, sportsman. I'm having trouble hearing the word.
Yes, a sportsman.
Okay.
Yes, this guy was a pro wrestler and a soccer player, a football player, and he felt that he had to bulk up tremendously, to become manly. And he eventually became so bulked up and so almost frightening to people that they wouldn't even want to engage him in sports and in wrestling. And so he found out that this wasn't somehow working for him, that there was a lot of disappointment and feeling of letting his family and letting his friends down because he didn't, in a manly way, reach the pinnacle of, getting to the Olympics and all that sort of stuff. So he began to feel terrifically apologetic and like a failure, so that sense of needs a kind of different kind of armoring through developing incredible amount of muscle. Just didn't do the trick, and the story he told himself of being a failure became so solid that he believed it utterly and ended his life. So that's another way of saying all the attempts at arriving at that kind of safety and security are going to, in some degree, fall apart. They're not going to work. The notion in Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings of the cocoon is exactly about that. That we imagine that we can burrow into something nice and cozy and sweet and soothing that will make this life wonderful. But then, holes keep developing in the cocoon and the fresh air comes in and it can be delightful and it can be scary.
Ariana, do you have something to say?
Sometimes I have the feeling that with my meditation practice that it's what the words are, but that it's turning in on myself and maybe a little bit too much of sort of navel gazing, and that I can get stuck there. I don't know if I'm expressing it, but that it can become a security thing also. There's some sort of protection being gained by doing this practice, even though I know, intellectually that that's not the case. But there's some aspect of that, I guess, in my practice, which I'm trying to figure out. I don't know if that's a common experience or something you go through or work with.
I'm not sure.
Just because you are noticing, you are spending a lot of time noticing and coming back and letting go, but it's, I don't know, is there, I'm not sure, it's just a thought.
Okay. Well, the one piece that sort of we haven't mentioned tonight is that there's sort of two sides to this endeavor. on the one hand, there's beginning to realize sort of what we've been doing wrong, as it were, our involvement with ego and error, and our neurotic patterns. And on the other side, there's beginning to acknowledge and get in touch with the beauty of the world as it is beyond ego. And this is described in lots of ways, especially in the Vajrayana, where there's the whole teaching about sacred world. And two things, pull us along the path. One is getting free from suffering and samsara, and the other is beginning to appreciate and fall in love with and be drawn to this world. And I think that's one of the reasons that Trungpa Rinpoche emphasized art, so much. Not just the literal practice of art, like painting and poetry, but what he called art in everyday life, which is, or the Shambhala teachings, which is so much about appreciating the beauty of the world. And the whole symbolism of it, with everything that goes in there.
So being more available to that.
More available and more appreciative and more inspired by it. Uplifted by it. When we can connect with it. And that's what really, I think, at some point takes over. He talked about shifting our allegiance, shifting our loyalty. And I think that can only happen when we begin to see more and more what the alternative is. I remember him saying to us one time, he said, the problem is that you can't see the alternative very well, And he said, if you could, you wouldn't waste a second. So there are these two sides. I think the more we practice, the more available the alternative, perhaps, begins to become for us. Well, we should end. What do you think? So shall we say, I don't have my chats, but we'll do the supplication to the Vidyadhara, and then the dedication of merit. Is that okay?
You have realized the Dharma taught, what it is, with oceans of skillful deeds of a Buddhist child. You possess the Buddha activity which tames untamable beings. May your body, speech, and mind be established in the Vajra nature. Through the strength of the Buddha's wisdom and compassion and that of his children far and wide, by the power of the oceans of Lokapala's and Dharmapala's activity, I ask for the good of the teachings and of beings. May the body, speech, and mind of the glorious Guru remain in the Vajra nature indestructibly. With the dawning of the blessings of the Gurus of the three lineages, you bring the sun of Dharma through the whole expanse of the world. The sight of you ripens and frees, and whatever encounters you is liberated. May the lotus garden of the good virtues beautify the world. By this merit may all attain omniscience, may they defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, through the ocean of samsara, and may I free all beings. May the Buddha's teachings spread and flourish. May all beings have happiness and joy. May the Dharma be practiced continuously, day and night. May the benefit of self and others be spontaneously accomplished. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus crown of the Rigden's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant,